Right. Yeah, I agree. Okay, time to start. Hope everybody's doing well. Test, test. I don't think I'm on yet. Testing. It's number 5. Am I on now? I think I'm on now. Good. But now my clicker's not working. It's blinking. It's blinking at me. Let's turn over to 2 Samuel 7. Now it's working. Good. Thank you very much. Okay, 2 Samuel 7, and in just a moment we're going to read verses 8 and following. Okay, we're ready for a discussion of God's providence as discussed in the Old Testament. Remember, we're in a class on great themes of the Old Testament. You might say Old Testament theology, topics that are of special interest as we study the Old Testament. And we've been talking about the nature of God so far. And now we have moved from talking about the nature of God as He is in Himself to God's interaction with His creation. And today we'll discuss how God provides, specifically for mankind, although He provides for all living things on the earth. Let's do a quiz that will require you to think back 2 weeks. Now, last week I was in a meeting in Huntsville, Alabama, and I really appreciated Ken filling in for me, and I know he did a great job. We talked some about what he was going to discuss, and I am excited to go back and hear the class later. I haven't had a chance to do that yet, but I'm sure it was a great class. I will mention one connection I made with the congregation there between that congregation and Lakeside, which I didn't know until just a few days before I went. I was on the phone with Pansy Herndon, and she was a member at West Huntsville. This is the congregation where my dad preaches, where I was preaching last weekend. She was a member there when she was a teenager. And it was not the building they're in now. It was not the building they were in before. It was the building either before that or the building before that. This congregation has been there over 100 years. They've been there about 115 years now. And so Pansy was there in the earlier stages. And she told me a funny story, which actually at least one person I talked to remembered this, that in the building where West Huntsville congregation worshiped back when Pansy was there, and she may be listening. I don't think she's here. I haven't seen her, but she's having foot surgeries and recovery from foot problems. But anyway, they had a window from the church building that looked out upon a drive-in movie theater. And so the teenagers could actually watch the movie from like the hallway of the church building looking out the window. I don't know if they could hear it. At the drive-in you had a speaker that you put on the side of your car. So they probably couldn't hear it, but they were satisfied at least to just watch it from where they were. Well, apparently the elders decided it wasn't probably a good idea for them to be congregating around that window watching movies at the church building. So they put up a little canopy over the window to prevent the line of sight to the movie theater. And after all these years, when Miss Pansy remembers her youth at West Huntsville, the first thing that comes to her mind, she said just about, of course she loved the people and all that, but one of the first things that comes to mind is, why did they have to put that canopy over the window to stop us from seeing the movies? So we had a laugh about that, both with Pansy before I left and then with the folks at West Huntsville when I told them that story. They thought that was really funny. And I told them they might want to get on the elders now and say, why did y'all do that? But of course, none of the elders are living. None of the elders are living from that stage. Okay, so we had a good laugh about that. In our last class period, we reviewed a number of reasons for which God is said in the Old Testament to be worthy of worship. Name one or more of these reasons. And you wouldn't have to name reasons that we discussed, but when you think about things that the Old Testament says about God that make him worthy of worship, what comes to your mind? Now remember, the way we framed this a couple of weeks ago was to say, when people look at other people and think of them as worthy of honor and special dignity, there are certain qualities. And these things may have to do with what the person has done, what the person's status is, what the person's power relative to others is, so forth. Well, what about God? What qualities does he possess in the Old Testament? And of course, if he has them in the Old Testament, he would have them in the New Testament too, but we're focused on the Old. So what properties is he said to have in the Old Testament that would make him worthy of worship? Does anyone remember any of those that we discussed? Yes, sir.
Well, I just remember that he was unique in so many ways.
Okay.
In his power and in his uniqueness. Yep.
Right. His holiness is one that we discussed. He's totally separate from anything that would be sinful, and he has total power. He's unlimited by power.
Omniscient, Good. Omnipotent, and
Right.
omnipresent.
We listed the three O qualities, and each of those, omniscience and omnipotence and omnipresence, all of those would be suggestive of God's worthiness of worship. That's good. What else? Anybody want to bring up any others? Yes. Frank, did you have one? Okay.
You mentioned that he gave of himself, Genesis 1:26 and 27.
Right, he gave his own image in Genesis 1:26 and 27 to the people he created, and that's a unique thing. That makes him worthy of worship. That is, all of us humans bear his image. Okay, what else?
He was perfectly just in everything that he did.
Right.
And he's righteous.
Okay, so his justice and how he deals with people, giving them what they deserve. That's good. But also his mercy in not giving what they deserve. And that seems like a paradox until you realize that God did punish all the saved people who were lost in sin on the cross. So all of that justice was meted out. It was just meted out on Christ instead of the people who actually deserved to die. Okay? What else? Yeah, very good. Right. Now, the Old Testament doesn't say that. As far as I can remember, Jesus said that. But it certainly is true that the Old Testament teaches his total knowledge in passages like Psalm 139 and other places. Okay, good. Yeah, that's an excellent response. Appreciate that. Keep thinking. Okay, number 2. Here's Romans 1:20. I think this is the third time this has been on the quiz because we're so insistent that we need to know this verse. What goes in the blank? That is, the eternal power and divine nature of God have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. Or if your translation says created, that would be fine. So that they are without excuse. Who is without excuse? You'd have to read the context, but who is without excuse? Who's without excuse? Not in this context. Who's without excuse? Right. Those who do not like to retain God in their knowledge, those people, he's specifically talking about pagan Gentiles who did not acknowledge the one true God. They are without excuse. They're acting as though the true God does not exist, but he really does. And our sermon this morning, we're not going to preach it now, but the sermon this morning has to do with God's existence. We're starting a series of lessons about songs, and it'll go through November and December. But the song we're going to preach on this morning is Our God, He is Alive. And we're going to talk about what each verse of that song teaches us about the implications of God's existence. So this verse would certainly be right there in that vein. Number 3, suppose someone said that God in the Old Testament is wrathful, whereas God in the New Testament is loving, like they have two different characters. How might we respond? Now, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, so go back in your memory if you can. If someone says the biblical picture of God is self-contradictory or inconsistent with itself, because in the Old Testament, God is all about rule keeping, and if you break the rules, his wrath is upon you. Whereas in the New Testament, it's more about your heart, and maybe you break the rules, but God's not so concerned about the rules, and actually God loves you so much that he's going to forgive you of whatever you do. So it's like two different deities. What would you say? Okay?
Back in the Old Testament, there are examples. Yes, you have his justice, but you also have to remember that there is great mercy that he showed upon the people, especially the children
Right.
of Israel. Because if he wanted it, he could have easily just decided that he wanted no more of them. But he continually to show mercy to them. And one of the finest examples of his mercy and his love in the Old Testament was toward the Ninevites.
Good. Very good. So the Ninevites were very wicked, but when they repented, God saved them. And Psalm 118 says, His mercy endures forever. Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. And certainly God showed great mercy to the Israelites when they were over and over again rebelling against Him in the wilderness, and yet He did not destroy them. So many examples we could give. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I believe it says too that God doesn't change.
That's right.
He can't create evil. He doesn't change, and He's the same. He was the same in the beginning, and He's the same now, and He'll be there forever.
That's certainly true. So we're trying to figure out how is it that God can be the same God with the same character over time, even though at some times God is said to do some things that He doesn't do at other times. But you're right, Malachi 3:6 says, I am the Lord, I do not change. And so His character doesn't change. And we said that it's very much like, we could illustrate it this way, like an earthly father with his children. He reacts differently based on what his children do, but his character remains the same. And he can make different rules based on different contexts. For example, as his children mature, he'll set different bedtime rules for his children. When does a 3-year-old need to go to bed versus when does a 17-year-old need to go to bed? Maybe a little different. Or what should be the rules for things that you can get out and use in the house if you're 12 versus if you're 4? Do you think you might let your 12-year-old use some things in the kitchen that you wouldn't let your 4-year-old use? Well, see, God as a father can respond to human situations in an appropriate way based on His justice and goodness that will look different based on the context. And so remember, especially Galatians 3 discusses how that the Old Testament was a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, there at the end of the chapter. So God prepared people for the coming of Christianity through the old law, and then Jesus was born at the appropriate time, Galatians 4:4. Okay, true or false? If God is omniscient, that is all-knowing, then God knows what it is like to sin. Is that true or false? That's false. We said omniscience means God knows all true propositions. If it's true, God knows it. All truths. So if you say something that is true, God already knows it. It doesn't mean God has the experience of having sinned. It means if it's true, God knows it. And that includes many truths of history and truths of the future. God knows all that. Okay, next, this is the two-parter. True or false, if God is omnipotent, that is all-powerful, then God can lie. That's false. Titus 1:2 says God cannot lie. So that raises the question, does that mean God lacks some power? If there's something God can't do, then does that mean that He lacks in power? No, that just means His character is perfect, and He is limited by His own character. That doesn't mean He's limited in power. It means He's limited by His own personality. And each of us is that way. And actually, it's a strength not to be able to lie. To be so committed to the truth that you can't lie. That's a strength, not a weakness, right? Is there a kind of strength that is measured out not in brute force, but in character? What about Jesus on the cross? In a sense, that's a portrayal of great weakness, because physically, He can do very little. It's very hard for Him to even breathe while He's on the cross. But on the other hand, wouldn't you say that's a great portrayal of strength, of character? To be able to endure all that because He has a purpose that He's trying to accomplish by dying on the cross. So see, we need to be very careful when we talk about power, that we recognize it's not as simple as saying God can do absolutely anything. Because if we say God's omnipotence means that He can do absolutely anything, then the skeptics are going to say, that doesn't make sense. That's incoherent. Can God make a four-sided triangle? You said He could do absolutely anything. You see, we have to be careful and say it the right way, which is God can do, let's put it this way, God can do anything he wants to do. That would be a good way to say it. Or we could say God is unlimited by power. That would be a fine way to say it. Or you could say God can do anything that is logically coherent and that is consistent with his nature. That would be a good way to say it too. So we got to say omnipotence and omniscience when we explain them. We have to say it in a way that doesn't open ourselves up to a lot of criticism. Okay, last one. Which of the following is false? A perfectly just God can be perfectly merciful. B, God is the ultimate benefactor or person who gives good things or does good things. C, God can do absolutely anything without qualification. Or D, God can allow events without directly causing them. Which of those is false? Well, it's usually C with me, isn't it? It seems like I usually make the right answer C. I need to vary that up a little bit. But C is the right answer because we just explained that. But it's very important to remember God can allow things without directly causing them. If we get mixed up on that, then we're liable to think that any bad thing that happens to us is something that God directly caused. When we say God's in control, that doesn't mean he is in control, but that doesn't mean he directly causes everything. He allows a lot of things. And again, make the analogy with parents and children. When we have our children, we allow a lot of things to go on that we're not necessarily causing, and in many cases don't really want to happen. Sometimes we allow our children to misbehave so that they can learn the lessons, and we can correct them afterward. But we could prevent a lot of misbehavior by just shutting them up in a small box and not letting them do anything. But would that really serve their growth? If we just say, okay, you can occupy this 9x9 cube and never get out and interact with the world. That would actually stifle their growth, but it might prevent a lot of disobedience. You see, we've got to, with our children, we allow a lot of things that we don't necessarily want to happen, but we're allowing our children to grow. Okay? Questions or comments? Okay, here's our plan of study. We're ready for November 14th today, God in his providence. We usually divide up providence into two categories, and this serves us well for the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. That is that God generally provides, and providence is just a word meaning providing, not a fancy word. God's providing. So we say God provides generally to all people. You see Genesis 8:22 is where God promises that the seasons and seed time and harvest would continue throughout Earth's history. So forever until the earth is finished, there will be seed time and harvest, which is the death knell to much of modern environmentalism. Because environmentalism says we're not going to have the seasons and the crops and the harvests unless we make major changes to how we're behaving. When God says he gives a guarantee. It's not conditional. There's nothing man can do about it. There will be the opportunity for seed time and harvest based on the conditions he gives until the end of time. So Genesis 8:22 is about the potential for mankind to harvest from the earth, and that's whether he's wicked or righteous. Of course, we recognize we could abuse the soil and make it in a given location impossible to harvest. We could never let the ground lie fallow or something like that. But apart from that, generally speaking, the earth is such that mankind can use it to get food from it, even if he doesn't believe in God. And if you go to the New Testament, of course, you find in Matthew 5:45 that Jesus said God causes the sun to shine on the evil and the good and the rain to fall on the just and on the unjust. So that's general providence. Things that God gives regardless of your attitude, regardless of your character. God still gives you those blessings. God gives the atheist and the murderer and the liar air to breathe and water to drink and so many blessings that should point them to their Creator. But in many cases it doesn't. So I think we all understand what general providence means. It doesn't mean that you will actually always have everything that you need. Mankind must get the water and must harvest the food and go pick from the plants and use the animals for food and clothing and so forth. But it's there. God has provided it for our use. And Genesis 8 and 9 are actually two major chapters about God's provision of not only plants to eat, but also animals to eat. So if people say, well, you're a Christian, how could you be in favor of killing animals for food? Well, because the Bible teaches we can do that in Genesis chapter 9. Okay, that's general providence, provided for everybody regardless of their character, regardless of whether they follow God or even acknowledge that he exists. Think about all those Gentiles that we just mentioned from Romans 1. Those who are without excuse, those who have been opposed to God over the centuries. Well, God nevertheless provided everything they needed all through all of those centuries to bring them up to the present date. So God is very generous, isn't he? The person who shakes his fist at God is able to do that only because God has given him a body and an arm and a hand. He's able to do that only because he's breathing in oxygen that God provided. He's able to shake his fist at heaven and curse God only because God gave him water enough to drink to sustain his physical body. You see how ironic it is for somebody to be an infidel? Because the entire possibility for them to live as an infidel is God's provision. So they should recognize that. Okay? Any questions or comments along those lines? Okay, but then let's shift gears and talk about special providence. Special providence is more limited, it's less usual, it's given to those under certain circumstances. The most obvious example is in answer to prayer. Because remember, Jesus explained that those who ask receive, and those who seek find, and those who knock have the door open to them. Or James 4 says, you do not have because you did not ask. The implication is, if you asked, you would have received something. Okay, so this is special providence given to certain people. Is everybody saved from their sins? No, of course, Jesus said in Matthew 7 that there's a wide way that leads to destruction and a narrow way that leads to life. So there's special provision of salvation only to a certain class of people, those who have been forgiven. Let's look over at Ezra chapter 8. What we want to do is key in on, well, I had you turn to 2 Samuel 7. Go to Ezra 8, and we'll come back to 2 Samuel in just a minute. Okay, this is Ezra assuring the people of God's provision as they rebuild the temple. And notice what he says. Look at, well, actually, this is, they're on their way to rebuild the temple. This is on their way back to Jerusalem. Look at verse 21. Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river Ahava, that we might humble ourselves before our God to seek from him a safe journey. Well, now they're going to ask God for something that he doesn't necessarily give to everyone. Seek from him a safe journey for us, our little ones, and all our possessions. For I was ashamed to request from the king, that is the Persian king Cyrus, troops and horsemen to protect us from our enemy on the way, because we had said to the king, the hand of our God is favorably disposed to all those who seek him. Notice here's special providence. This is favorable disposition of God, not to everybody, but to those who do what? To those who seek him, to those who are looking for a blessing from him, to those who seek him, but his power and his anger are against all those who forsake him. So we fasted and sought our God concerning this matter, and he listened to our entreaty. Okay, so there is the people of Israel saying, we need a blessing from God, and we're asking for a particular blessing for us, not the same blessing he gives to everyone. Okay, now think about how this special providence might be either miraculous or non-miraculous. Non-miraculous first. Esther is a very interesting book, isn't it? For many reasons, but one is it's the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God. But doesn't it have God's fingerprints on it? We usually say the book of Esther is a prime example of God providing for his people. And it's especially notable because if wicked Haman's plot, now I'm not going to tell the whole story, but you know Haman was plotting to destroy the entire race of the Hebrews in captivity. He was going to commit genocide. And Esther stepped in and asked the king to protect him. And the king was her husband. She was the queen at the time. She was an Israelitess who had been elevated to the position of queen. And in Esther 4:13 and 14, Mordecai, her cousin, who reared her in captivity, said, who knows but what you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And the Jews throughout the centuries have looked to the book of Esther as God providing for the sustaining of the Davidic line, particularly the Judeans, because the Messiah was going to come from the tribe of Judah, as we know from Genesis 49:10, that God provided the seed line's continuity through captivity by putting Esther in the position to intercede for them. You see? Well, there wasn't a miracle associated with that. You can see the natural story, and maybe that's why the name of God isn't in the book of Esther, is because God wants us to see that without striking anybody dead, without making any rivers part, without doing any, not speaking from heaven in an audible voice, nothing that you find in many other books of the Bible where God makes a miraculous appearance or some kind of miraculous intervention. Without doing any of that, God still naturally, using the causes that are already present in nature, provides the sustenance of his people and the protection from Haman's plot. So there's special providence, but it's of a non-miraculous nature. Does that make sense? Okay, then there's also, of course, the miraculous, and these are some of the most familiar stories. For example, in Exodus 14:13, Moses was leading the people, and they were about to cross the Red Sea, and he said, "See the deliverance of the Lord." And what did the Lord do? He doesn't do this for everybody. This is special providence. He opened up the Red Sea through a wind that blew all night long, and the Israelites got to cross over the Red Sea on dry ground. Can you imagine the wind that would be so persistent and hard that it would dry up the ground of the sea like that so that they could walk across as if there wasn't any sea there at all? So that was a miracle, and it was God's providence. It was special, miraculous providence. Or let's look over at Nehemiah chapter 9. And this is when he gives a review of what the Israelites had done, really about how God had done for the Israelites, how God had provided for them. Look at Nehemiah 9, beginning in verse 6. The Levites say this as they are confessing the sins of the people. The Feast of Booths has been restored. The wall has been built. Ezra has read the law, so they're reinstituting Hebrew religion after the captivity in Babylon. And here's what they say. "You alone are the Lord. You have made the heavens, the heaven of heavens, with all their host, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them." Here's providence, God providing for all the people. "You give life to all of them, and the heavenly host bows down before you. You are the Lord God, who chose Abram and brought him out from Ur of the Chaldees and gave him the name Abraham. You found his heart faithful before you and made a covenant with him to give him the land of the Canaanite, of the Hittite and the Amorite, of the Perizzite, the Jebusite, and the Girgashite, to give it to his descendants. And you have fulfilled your promise, for you are righteous. You saw the affliction of our fathers in Egypt and heard their cry by the Red Sea. Then you performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh, against all his servants and all the people of the land, of his land. For you knew that they acted arrogantly toward them," that is, toward the Israelites, "and made a name for yourself, as it is this day. You divided the sea before them, so they passed through the midst of the sea on dry ground, and their pursuers you hurled into the depths, like a stone into raging waters. And with a pillar of cloud you led them by day, and with a pillar of fire by night, to light for them the way in which they were to go. Then you came down on Mount Sinai and spoke with them from heaven. You gave them just or righteous ordinances and true laws, good statutes and commandments. So you made known to them your holy Sabbath and laid down for them commandments, statutes, and law through your servant Moses. You provided bread from heaven for them, for their hunger. You brought forth water from a rock for them, for their thirst. And you told them to enter in order to possess the land which you swore to give them." And then you can go on and listen to the unrighteous response that the Israelites gave after God made all that providential care. Looking at those verses, you see that the priests are basically rehearsing the books of, well, which two books? Someone tell me. Which two books of the Old Testament did the Levites review there? I hope this is springing to mind. I hear like a low rumble. Some people, I hear, but I trust what's being rumbled is, Exodus and Numbers, Exodus and Numbers. Was that what it was being rumbled? Exodus and Numbers? Okay, I believe you. But those are the two books that they rehearsed. And notice that the care that the Levites reviewed was all miraculous. There was a lot of natural care that God gave the people, but the ones that the people wanted to remember especially were the miraculous ones. Okay, so there's general and special providence in the Old Testament. We could go back further than Exodus and Numbers and just discuss what God did for people, because the first few chapters of Genesis are just a revelation of God's providence. For example, after creating the earth, which is providence in itself, God immediately was involved in sustaining its life, providing the growth, providing a mist that came up out of the ground so that the plants could grow. After God created, that should say, humans in his image, he immediately communicated with and provided for them directly. He immediately said, here's what you can eat, here's how you can eat it, you're taken care of in the garden. After man sinned, what does God immediately do? Well, he pronounces the curse on mankind and on woman and on the ground. But then God immediately says, here's how I'm going to fix the problem. Here's how I'm going to save mankind through the seed of woman. And then after man continued to sin, God provided counsel to help him do better. I'm thinking of the story of Cain and Abel, where God, after Cain is wroth, unjustly angry at his brother, God comes and counsels him. And that's really what God does with us. When we start to have negative attitudes, sinful thoughts, God has already provided in his word a mechanism to correct that. We may not listen to it, we may not study it as we should, but the provision is there. Okay, when man continued to sin as the generations rolled on, God continued to provide, nevertheless, the opportunity for mankind to walk with him. I'm thinking about Enoch. No reason to think that Enoch was unique. Well, he was unique in that God seems to have just taken him right to heaven without him dying. That was unique. But the opportunity for mankind to walk with God was, as far as we can tell, just generally open. God's never made it so that mankind was forced to live away from him. So God has always provided all through the centuries. Remember, we gave you this outline of Old Testament history. This slide we put up the first day of class, and we sort of divided it up into three categories. And I want to remember that to focus on how God provided through all these different parts of the Old Testament. In the patriarchal age, in Israel before they became a kingdom, when they were living under the law of Moses but were under the more direct rule of God in a theocracy, and then after they became a monarchy, God always provided for the people. And here are the passages in which you can find those sections of Scripture in Old Testament history. And we divided it up further into all of these sections. So if you want an outline of Old Testament history, here are the sections. And remember, it ends in your Bible at the end of the book of Nehemiah. And then you have the poetical books and the prophetic books after that. We're going to key in just a moment for the last few minutes that we have on 2nd Chronicles and 1st Chronicles, where Judah is discussed absent Israel, although the history covers the same time when Israel and Judah coexisted, but Israel is not mentioned in the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And we'll say maybe why that is in just a moment. We want to remember the deportations of the Jews. Now, remember this history with me, and I'm going to tell you why it's so important for our purposes of talking about God's providence in just a moment. This is the Babylonian deportation of Jews into captivity. You can read about it at the end of the book of 2nd Kings, and also at the end of the book of 2nd Chronicles. And this is the three-stage process whereby thousands and thousands of Jews, the most prominent members of society, were taken away into Babylon. And of course, some of them fled into Egypt as well, including Jeremiah. Okay, so we're looking at the end of the 600s and the beginning of the 500s BCE. There are three distinct periods of return Now, I know this may seem tedious, but I'm going to show you in just a minute why I'm so insistent in bringing up the deportation of the Jews and then the return. And it has to do with God providing for them. Because when we look at 1st and 2nd Chronicles, these books are specifically designed. We don't study them as much as we should, but these books are specifically designed to help the returning exiles recognize that they're part of an ongoing story. That God who provided for David, and even before David, but especially David, that the God who took care of David and promised that his monarchy, his dominion, that his dynasty would be everlasting, that same God is the God who is with the returning exiles, who are wondering, now that they're coming back from captivity and their homes in many cases have been destroyed, and the temple has been burned to the ground, the walls have been destroyed, they're coming back to a situation in which there's basically poverty, and they've become comfortable perhaps in Babylon. I mean, the children of Israel set up their lives in Babylon, but a number of people repented before the Lord and wanted to come back to Jerusalem. Well, when they came back, it seemed in a way there was nothing for them. And they might have wondered, is God really with us or not? Does God support us in what we're doing? Is he going to take care of us? And that's the same problem that many of us sometimes face when hard times come, is we start to question, is God going to take care of me? Well, 1st and 2nd Chronicles should be a great encouragement to us in that regard. Not that we're going back to Palestine to rebuild a structure to please God. That's not the point. But the point is, we serve in the same kingdom, in the same spiritual lineage, with all of those people who came back from Babylonian captivity. They came back saying, are we connected to the promises of God that he made through Jacob and through Abraham and then through David and his seed line? Are we part of that? Because we've been away in captivity in another land for 70 years. It's a new generation. Are we part of that same heritage? Does God care about us as surely as he cared about David? Well, the answer in 1st and 2nd Chronicles is yes. And the answer is given by way of a historical review that leads up to the present and then tells the people, you be faithful to God just like David and the people before him, God's heroes of faith in the Old Testament, were faithful, and he'll be providing for you just as surely as he did for them. So here are the three distinct periods of return. Well, the return really begins in 536, rebuilding of the temple. In the 470s, we see Esther reigning in Persia. Esther, of course, occurs between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7. And then we have the rebuilding of the wall and the restoration of Jerusalem under Nehemiah and Ezra. So Ezra records some events that occur before he actually came back, but then beginning in Ezra 7, he records the events that occurred while he was there. Okay, any questions or comments about the timeline before we talk about what's in 1st and 2nd Chronicles precisely? Now, you could get God's providence from any book in the Old Testament. I just thought it'd be nice to camp out on Chronicles for just a few minutes, and we may come back to this next week if we don't have time to do very much. Here are the heroes in the story and the villains in the story. We're not going to review all that. But notice that God had already promised that he was going to stay involved and that he was going to keep providing for the people. The scepter, that is ruling power, would not depart from the tribe of Judah until Jesus came. And indeed, the Jews had governors who reigned over the people, even during captivity, in a limited sense. There were some people left in the land, and there was still a governor. His name was Ishmael, while the people were in captivity. So there was a governor in place even while, and it was a Jewish governor, under the thumb, sure, under the thumb of the Babylonians and the Persians, but there was a Jewish governor, a governor from Judah. And so that shows that God's promise had not failed. And Jewish governors reigned. They didn't have kings anymore. The last king was Zechariah, and he's the one who got his eyes put out and taken into captivity. So the kings were over, but there was a Jewish governor who was still in charge. So autonomy was not totally gone from Judah until Jesus came. The last one was the Herods. The last set of governors were the Herodian governors during the time of Christ. So Jesus came right when the scepter was taken away from Judah. The throne of David was going to endure. Now here's 2 Samuel 7. Let's go ahead and read that. 2 Samuel 7, beginning in verse 11. Even from the day that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord also declares to you that the Lord will make a house for you. Remember, David said, I'm going to build the Lord a house. And God said, no, you're a man of war, you're a man of blood. Your son's going to build me a house, but I'm going to build you a house. That's always fascinated me, that David came to the Lord saying, I'm going to build you a house, and God reversed it. I will build you a house. Verse 12, when your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you, who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name. That's Solomon building the temple. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So in a sense, the house that Solomon built is the church. It wasn't the church then, but remember Hebrews 12 says we've come to Zion, to the city of God, and the temple of God, or the house of God today, according to 1 Timothy 3:15, is the church. So the house that was built that's going to endure forever turns out to be the church, built by Christ, who's seated on the throne of David, according to Acts 2, where Peter explains that Jesus is seated on his throne. And we may go into a little bit more detail about that, but there's this continuity that I want you to see between the promise to David that his son was going to have a house that would be forever, and that was Solomon. But in a more distant sense, David had a son, someone in his lineage, who built a spiritual house that will never be destroyed, and that's Jesus. So there is a continuity of providence throughout all of this. And so God is going to be involved. He's going to keep on providing throughout the centuries. And then Jeremiah promises in Jeremiah 25 and in chapters 31 and 33, read all that about the new covenant that God is going to make with his people. There's fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy in the Old Testament, but also in the New. And Jeremiah says you're going to be in captivity for 70 years, but then you're going to come back, and there eventually will be a new covenant. And that new covenant was the one that Jesus came to give. The new covenant in his blood, which he said as he established the Lord's Supper. So the new covenant was prophesied by Jeremiah. It would occur after the people came back from 70 years of captivity. And the land would be bought and sold by Israelites after Babylonian captivity. Interesting that Jeremiah bought a field that belonged to his cousin. His cousin apparently needed the money, and Jeremiah had the first right of refusal according to the law of Moses. So Jeremiah bought the land, but knew that he wasn't going to be able to ever use the land, that the land was going to be there, but he was going to be gone into captivity. So he knew that the captivity was about to occur. He wouldn't be able to use the land, but he bought it anyway. And why did he do that? Because he wanted his family, when they returned from captivity, to be able to use the land. That shows how confident he was that what he was preaching about the people going away into Babylon and coming back really would occur. So God was going to keep on providing. Then we turn to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which was written again after the people have returned, or as they're returning from captivity. And you'll see as you read it, and maybe if you have time between now and next week, read 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It would show you that there's a lot of repeat. If you've ever read it, and I trust everybody's read, if you've read your whole Bible, you've read Chronicles at some point. They are rehearsing. The compiler, many people think it's Ezra, probably Ezra, put together the Chronicles. But when he compiles all this material, he's reaching back into things that are recorded in the Kings and Samuel books, which were originally one book. Samuel was one book, Kings was one book, Chronicles was one book. We've divided them up into two. But all of that history has, many selections from that history are brought up in Chronicles. It's selected to emphasize God's blessing upon the nation. So, for example, very few of David's shortcomings are recorded in Chronicles. There's no Bathsheba incident. There's no rebellion of Absalom. There is David numbering the people, so it's not totally whitewashing David as if to say he never sinned. It's not painting a false narrative. So David does sin in Chronicles, but it's not near as much. The idea is, here is how God has taken care of the people. Wonderful things have happened, and wonderful things will happen for you if you'll remain faithful. It's got the genealogies. Maybe some of the most notorious passages in the Bible for killing daily Bible reader plans that people have when the new year begins. They might make it to Chronicles, but the first 9 chapters of Chronicles are difficult. because it's genealogies, and people don't much like to read genealogies. But why are they there? They're there so that when the people return from captivity, they know what tribe they're part of, so they can know which part of the land they occupy, because remember, the promised land was divided up based on tribal affiliation. So if you're in Reuben, or if you're in Manasseh, or if you're in Judah, you know which tribe, which part of the land you go to, based on your tribal affiliation. Well, the genealogies would provide that. But then they would also provide who's in the tribe of Levi and who is not, so that you know who the priests are when you set up worship at the temple again. And then they would also provide who's in the different tribes for the purpose of assisting the priests. You remember John the Baptist's father had a certain time of year when he would go to the temple for a 2-week period to assist the priests. Well, the tribes did that. Everybody, all of the men would have a time when they would go and assist the priests if they were able, and the calendar was divided up based on tribe. Well, you knew what tribe you were a part of because of these genealogies. And other reasons too. I think we'll take maybe the first part of class next week, maybe the whole class, to talk about 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And again, you could use any book in the Old Testament to demonstrate God's providence. But I thought since we don't talk about these books as much, let's take some time to see how God insists, because this is really the point of the books, that God insists he is going to take care of Israel after they come back from captivity in the moment when it seems perhaps least likely to them that God is really thinking of them, that God is really taking care, so that when we hit times in our lives when it seems perhaps to us least likely that God cares what's going on with us, that he still does and that he will not forsake us. Okay, very good. Thank you. We'll see you next week.